objections, you can voice them now, or as they say, you can keep silent forever. Right. Okay, I can also kind of cut it out, bits of it later, but it would be harder. So the theme of gender in Equestrianism and horsemanship, it's very important. It's still very controversial. So we have this stereotype of ponygirls like ponies, and then real men should ride stallions. And in the Middle Ages, everybody seemed to ride stallions. On the other hand, Hilke isn't here, so if she had been here, she would have been able to talk more about the idea that the Saracens or Arabians are only riding mares, and because they are those strange people who only ride mares and so on. Even today, the stereotypes persist. There is this saying about how you deal with different horses. You tell a gelding, ask a stallion, negotiate with the mare. And I know many people just don't like mares. I like mares super a lot. I have 2 mares, and I want to have more mares because they're more interesting to work with.
Yeah.
They have personality, you have a dialogue, and it's like you never know what to expect there. And this gelding is a bit like it's the same every day. Nothing changes. So, and we know that from sports, from different sports, that mares could have actually very good results in eventing. There are famous mares and so on. So I think it's the same argument a little bit with women. Women don't have testosterone, and they're not competitive, and they're not good for sports. That's something I'm going to talk about later. But we have 3 papers. So Kate, you are going to talk about stallions in archaeology. We had a slight change to program with Susanna having to remove herself at the last moment, but Edgar luckily was up to the task and stepped up. And he's going to cover the medieval period and talking about stallions and men. Very sexy. And I'm going to move into today's situation, horse racing, and how it's horse racing is a little bit relies on stereotypes, on what we think people in the Middle Ages were doing, just to say why women are worthless as jockeys. And then after these 3 papers, as usual, we hope for an exciting discussion, and everybody is welcome to participate. So make sure, non-speakers, that you are keeping your microphones on during the papers. You can keep your videos on or off. It's up to you, depending on what you are doing, how dressed you are or undressed. And then for discussion, you can turn your microphones on. I'm not blocking anyone, okay? So, okay, the floor is
9 people to you. Anyways.
All right. Are you ready for me?
Yes. Okay, you can
perfect.
Start.
I will share. Okay. Let me move the little, oopsie.
That's a good.
I can't, there we are. Come on, there we go. So my preference obviously is for mares, and polo we use almost exclusively mares. So I have a bias towards mares, and I like them a lot, and they seem to just give a little bit extra. There are playing stallions in polo, but they are the exception rather than the rule. And the vast majority of polo uses only mares. And I've had stallions in my barns full of mares, but they've been really well behaved. So that's my own personal bias. But today I'm going to talk about kind of a response to the Phages paper that came out. Horse males became overrepresented in archaeological assemblages during the Bronze Age. So I am going to go over, let's see, here we go. So are male horses actually overrepresented in archaeological assemblages through time? How does this reflect herd management strategies? How is it related to human gender roles? And how do we know any of this? So to sex archaeological horse skeletons, you have to rely basically on three different things: the teeth, the pelvis, and DNA. There's not there's basically no statistical difference in terms of mares or stallions or geldings in terms of size. People have tried to quantify it. It doesn't work. But the three things we rely on are primarily the teeth, the canines, which most of you are familiar with. But 25% of mares have canines. And here's an example of a mare with canines. They're residual generally when they have them, but they are present. And I gave you some pictures of the skulls so you can see how we find them. But unfortunately, in my period, they're mostly fragmented. So we don't have a lot of good data on horse sex from the Bronze Age unless there's been DNA work done. So the pelvis is the second thing. And again, because the pelvises I deal with are fragmented, this is kind of a difficult thing to use for sexing horse skeletons. And I'm not sure that it's super accurate. And other archaeologists have made this claim too, that it may not be the best or most obvious way to sex skeletons. But this is showing the pelvis and from this orientation, and this is how it sits on the skeleton. And the pubic tubercle is the one we look at, this little bump where the circle is. So the Phages paper looked at a large sample of sexed horse skeletons by DNA. So here is the breakdown of all the sites they looked at around Europe, or Eurasia, I guess. Excuse me. And in the Upper Paleolithic, so when horses were prey, there was a pretty balanced ratio of mares or of males to females. It gets confusing because you want to say mares, but males to females, and I've colored it, green being males and yellow being females. In the Upper Paleolithic, from both Belgium and Siberia, there's a pretty balanced amount, although there was a little slight skew to females. When horses become managed, or a prey managed herd, such as Botai, there still is a pretty balanced ratio of males to females. And we know at Botai that there were some domesticated Przewalski's horse types, not being on the domesticated lineage, but there were also wild herds that they hunted. So there was a mix. And that probably attributes to the balanced ratio, because they were milking mares. You would think there would be more mares in the assemblage, but it's pretty balanced. For all time periods, for the last 4,600 years, from about 2600 BC, they report about 3.4 males for every one female horse recovered in archaeological assemblages. So in their entire sample, there's a pretty strong bias towards males. And they point at the change for when this moves from balanced herds to more males in the shift to the Bronze Age. Now, this is also the shift to the domesticated lineage, so it's hard to say that is unrelated. And then they didn't define, they split it up in between funerary context and excluding ritual burial sites, but they didn't define either of these categories, so I'm not actually sure what they're talking about here. But again, there's a pretty high skew in the Bronze Age towards males in archaeological assemblages. In the Bronze Age of Hungary, there's a few burials with stallions, but most remains are pretty highly fragmented. In the Belbeker site at Albertfalva, that's right in Budapest, there's a bay stallion from Dunaváros Kossuth-Padlás. There's a black stallion, and this is the first evidence of the domesticated lineage in Hungary, and it shows up in Hungary. And then also in Slovakia, there is a chestnut stallion that's the first on the domesticated stallion Y haplotype. So there are stallions showing up in the DNA. These are all DNA tested. In Romania, a colleague of mine, Amy Nicodemus, has a really interesting site. So it has probably the highest percentage of horses of any place in the Carpathian Basin, and she's got a pretty balanced ratio. But the interesting part about this assemblage, there's two things. One is that they have these bone piles that look like feasting deposits on the main part of the site. Basically, it looks like stacks of bones, and they're all mares. And she actually has pelvises or pelvies, but they're they're somewhat fragmented, but she's actually able to tell that they're sexed female. But the interesting part, again, is that 2/3 of these mares have canines, or two of the three that she has have canine as vestigial canines. So it's an interesting thing that this one of the first, whole horses that we're able to look at actually has mares with canines. So that's really an interesting story there. Not really sure what's going on. If mares are preferred for feasting, it's difficult to tell. In Mongolia, a little bit later, around basically a number of sites around Mongolia in the late Bronze Age after 1300 BC, there's a preference for males across Mongolian late Bronze Age sites, and it looks like male horses are preferred in the main or largest tumuli type things they have here, and that's reported by Taylor. And then when we start getting burials in the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age Hallstatt, you get a preference for young males and old mares. So from the canines and pelvies, there are no females. There's old males and at least 2 geldings. And the individual buried horses actually have a more balanced ratio of males to females to indeterminate. So when they're buried with humans, they skew male. When they're buried by themselves, they're balanced. So, and then they also mentioned that the mares that they have are pretty aged. And this is Kemetova. Librato reports from Iron Age Kazakhstan at the famous Burel Kurgan 11, Scythian or Pazyrak, from 300 BC. There are 13 males and 0 females. So the interesting part about this sample is that only 2 of them are related, and there's 11 different Y haplotypes, meaning that there's almost no inbreeding coefficients. It looks like, perchance, that these were horses brought in for sacrifice from a lot of different people, from tribes across vast areas. But also these genes show variants related to facilitate horse milking. So we know mares are important. And then the Pazyrak Kurgans also show evidence of geldings when they have actually mummified remains. They're able to see that they're geldings. And this is the famous Burel Kurgan 11, and you can see it under excavation. I think all of us would be happy to be buried like this as horse people, with a whole number of horses. And I'm a weird archaeologist, and I have all my horse bones. Well, some of them are still in the ground, and I have some here. So we'll see if that works out for me. But these are the way that some of them looked at Burel when they were excavated. They show evidence of poleaxing. Here's a diagram, and then some of the injuries on the head. And then this is what their reconstruction of what they look like within the burial tomb. So highly decorated, lots of different types of harnesses. They were all harnessed and saddled in different attire. So the tack seems to be related to the different tribal affiliations potentially. When we move into late Iron Age Switzerland, there is no preference for males in La Tène sites. The ratio is about 1 male for every 1.5 females. And so there's a little bit of a skew towards females, but there's no preference for males in late Iron Age Switzerland. So about 150 BC to 30 CE. And then the interesting thing starts to get into the Viking Age, late Iron Age and early Viking Age in Sweden. It's balanced. There's this wonderful site that has very detailed, I think it's called Sodala, I can't remember. Medievalists might know it better, but highly decorated tack and seemingly an even ratio based on DNA and on sexing the skeleton from males to females. And then this is just an image, a Viking image here, an image of a Viking settlement in the Orkney Islands, and they have a nice little picture of somebody riding a horse, and isn't it lovely? And more horses hitched up here. And then the famous Birka warrior we know is a female and looks like she's buried with 2 male horses. They call them stallions. This tends to run in the media reports always report them as stallions and not stallions and geldings, because it probably makes for a catchier headline. Because, oh, here's another image of what this might have looked like, the burial. And then in Viking Age Iceland, you start getting a massive skew towards males, a preference for males in Iceland. But it looks like in the the context isn't exactly clear, but with outside of burials of horses buried with people, it looks like there's a skew towards females. So preference for males, but consuming females. And then this gets even more distinct in another study that's really recent from Canines and Pelvies. Lifeson reports a preference for males buried with both sexes. So both men and women are buried with horses, but there is a strong preference for male horses in burials. But again, only 26% of these were sexed this way. So it's a very small sample of a larger group of horses. So when they do the DNA, it might be more balanced. But the interesting thing was that the headlines were that men preferred being buried with stallions. Well, they were buried with both sexes, and actually, again, the media is misreporting about the linkage between men and stallions here, because clearly women are also buried with horses. So the issue I take with this paper is the linkage they make with gender burial practices in people. There are we start getting more gendered grave goods in the Bronze Age. So we have a material culture that's related to men and related to women, but there's a lot of overlap. Again, this tends to be kind of a trope that gets pushed, that there are elite male chariot warriors all over the place in the Bronze Age, and they also try to tie this to human gendered and residence practices. And there's actually a very small amount of these sites that have actually been looked at this way, but they're making sweeping judgments about all of Europe having this system, and it's just not holding up when it's under closer scrutiny. In my sample, I had, so I looked at Middle Bronze Age in Hungary to Late Bronze Age compared to the Avar period, which we know has more distinctive gendered identities, and horses are clearly being used in mounted warfare, and they're important in how people reconcile their identities. In the Middle Bronze Age, there's about 35% versus 54% male in terms of who's riding. So within the sample of everyone added together, and this actually this shows the ratio of the acetabulum. So over 1.1 is a elongated acetabulum, and the riders are above this blue line and even more clearly above the red line. And when I group them all together, there's about 35% of the sample that are riders that are female and 54% male, but there's 12% that are indeterminate. There's less actual size and gender difference in the humans at this point in time. There's actually not a lot of sexual dimorphism in people as much in the Middle Bronze Age. In the Late Bronze Age, in my sample, it was a balanced ratio. It was 50% female, 50% male riders. And the Avar period, you can tell this changes quite significantly, where women are riding, but they drop in significant numbers compared to the Bronze Age. So the big question is, are male horses overrepresented in archaeological assemblages through time? Yes, but this varies. It looks like there's a pretty good evidence that males are appearing more in archaeological assemblages, but when you can see with the Viking cases, there's a lot of variation. In one site, there's no difference, and other sites in Iceland, there's all male horses. So you need to look at it by period and by culture rather than making kind of a sweeping judgment through time. But as most of us would think about, that in terms of reflecting herd management strategies, it varies, but culling excess juvenile males, old horses, and keeping high-value mares is a pretty standard practice in breeding, and seems to probably be reflected in what shows up in the archaeological assemblages. So there's young males, old male horses of both sexes, and high-value middle-aged mares are generally not in the sample for the most part. And how is this related to human gender inequalities? Well, in the Bronze Age, they make the case that there's major gender inequalities and that men have a higher status than women. And that is just an assumption, and it's not one that actually matches with the data when you start looking at it more carefully. It's an assumption that's been made through time, as you were talking about, Anastasia, that there is the idea that men are the people that are riding horses, where in my sample, clearly that's not the case. And then the gender differences in burial goods in the Bronze Age are not, they have equal amounts of grave goods, but there's not actually that many. There's this idea you get a lot of metal and you get a lot of grave goods and weapons in the Bronze Age, but that happens very late in the Bronze Age. When you see that shift to the Iron Age, you start getting more people buried with horses. So you have to look by culture in terms to determine if this is anything to do with gender inequalities. Thinking back and imposing modern gender ideals about masculinity being associated with stallions and femininity being associated with mares, that is a hard assumption to hold true through time. And then, how do archaeologists know any of this? We like bones and thinking about them. So we spend a lot of time thinking about, that's what we have to work with. So I'm interested to hear in terms of, when you get to the Viking era and the medieval periods, what are the written records? Because I know very little about this, so I'm quite curious. So that's about all I have to say about preferring stallions.
Okay, thank you very much for your fascinating talk. That's really interesting. And yeah, that's something unexpected. And of course, the way media highlights stallions over mares, it has something to do with how we view horses today as well. Okay, so we will keep questions, comments to the end. So maybe, Edgar, you could be talking not so much about Vikings, but about Welshmen.
Yes, I will be talking about Welshmen, but roughly the same period. I will be talking about gender aspects of horsemanship and horse ownership as recorded in medieval Welsh law. And why I was saying we're talking almost about Vikings. When we say medieval Welsh law, we usually mean the law code of King Howell the Good, who reigned in mid-10th century. And all existing manuscripts containing the code start with prologue, how he assembled his barons and his prelates in a place called White House, and they decided what the law of the land shall be. However, as we shall see further, the laws, of course, changed over time, and when it comes to horses, it is particularly visible. So, the horses played an important role in Welsh culture, it seems, because even in the laws themselves, the earliest, or at least one of the earliest mentions of the horse, if you'll take a book and look at the index, will be a metaphoric one. It speaks about 8 pack horses of the king, and they're not pack horses, they're his sources of regular cash, taxes and such. However, as for gender and actual horses, riding the horses, at least in theory, from the legal point of view, wasn't a gendered activity. The laws of the court contain the list of king's retainers, and there are both men and women, not to mention Queen herself, and all of them have the same 2 privileges. They don't pay taxes, they are issued a horse. Wouldn't that be lovely? Did we freeze? No, we didn't.
We didn't freeze.
So both men and women were supposed to be able to ride. However, the ownership of the horses already becomes gendered, once again from the legal perspective. The laws of Howell the Good permitted divorce. And upon divorce, all the property the family had should be divided 50-50. And there is a long list which spouse gets what. And horses are specifically not mentioned. Although both in terms of the value of the horse, they should have been there. They're at the very least expensive, and also in terms of presumed purpose of the division as described in the law, they should have been there somewhere as well, because there is a theory that while allowing divorce, the law discouraged it by creating this very idiosyncratic rule for dividing property. So all heavy, unwieldy stuff you had to be very strong to work with went to the wife, whereas small things, including the house cat, went to the husband. But by this logic, wife should have gotten the horses. Well, she doesn't. But now, and there is a further, let's call it more in modern way, paragraph, which in the other section, which deals with compensations, which where it is said that three things cannot be taken from a man: his sword, his horse, and money he gets as the compensation for injured honor. So horsemanship is apparently is somewhere along with family honor and warrior's honor. Hence, the horses horses are this man's thing. Now, in the notice about me speaking instead of the intended speaker, I mentioned a connection between tails and beards. Now let's talk a little bit about that. Yes, beard. But first, there are categories of horses described within the law, and there are expensive horses, destriers, palfreys, cheaper rounces for more common riders. Well, they all have French names. As I said, the law changed over time, so they have all these French names. Apart from the warhorse, the destrier, they use the Welsh word, which originally meant stallion. In other texts, this word is used just as stallion. And when describing what the destrier is, in describing the gelding, they say the price of a gelding is, if I remember correctly, £1 silver. However, unless it is a destrier. So a destrier could have been a gelding as well, because the law defines a warhorse by the training and the way it is kept. It should be kept indoors. From autumn till mid-spring, somewhere in April. So, and the warhorse loses its value and is considered just a horse because the given legal price for the warhorse is very high, some £100 even, whereas a plain horse is £1. Now the warhorse loses its value to £1 to just a horse if its tail is cut. Interestingly, if just the hair on the tail is cut, it loses its value until the tail grows back. And if the offender is found, he has to keep and feed the horse, so nobody will see it with the cropped tail. If the tail, however, is cut with the flesh, with the bone, it loses the value permanently. and is given to the offender. So when you look at it from the modern perspective, you start getting ideas. How can you scam a wealthy horse owner in medieval Wales? Just to cut the tail of it and you get a well-bred stallion. And you can breed more good stallions from it, because now it's yours. But they seem to see that differently. And that's where the beard comes in, where at least I see this connection. Now, when I mentioned divorce, and there are strange rules for divorce as well. A wife can divorce from her husband if he has bad breath, whereas a husband can divorce from his wife if she wishes blemishes onto his beard. So if let your beard fall off, no, I need a lawyer, go away. So maybe there is a connection there. So beards on humans and tails on stallions have a connection to virility, strength, and once again honor. And that's why probably they were willing to give an expensive horse, which only has cropped tail, to whoever did that, because no high-born Welshman, because who else would own their horse for £100, would ever be seen in public with such a horse. So,
Is that it?
probably yes. I'm sorry if it was shorter than expected or a little bit rambling.
It's just 10 minutes, so you are perfect on
so
time. I will have a question. I think maybe not just to Ergo, but to all horse people. If somebody could answer it immediately, how do you know if the dock of the tail was cut, if it grows back? I have never seen horses which had the dock cut. Maybe somebody knows. Does it show after this?
I had a mare that got she got a tail stuck in a door at some point in time, and it had to be removed, and it did not, the hair grew kind of around it, but it did not grow back in a normal fashion. So it wasn't a nice full tail. We never had to tie her tail up really, so that was nice. But yeah, it was pretty clear that it had gotten, and I think before we had it surgically repaired. It was it was kind of loose in the sheath of the verts that were still there. The caudal verts were loose, and so it kind of waddled around before we had it cut off permanently. And then the hair just kind of stayed around it, but didn't grow long.
And anyways, you can touch, so when you're buying the horse, probably could.
Well, you are buying the horse, yes, but if you are riding, if it's visible, then yes.
Visible.
Yeah.
Well,
you could tell on her.
Yeah. Okay.
In any case, this being a traditional society, and as insular as Welsh communities tended to be, so probably everybody knows.
Yeah. Okay, you don't want to be seen on a horse like this. A real man shouldn't be.
You mentioned riding that.
Poor horses. But then they could have a very nice life with mares. Okay, I'll try to share my PowerPoint. Hope it works. So I'll have lots of pictures, maybe not so much text. Okay, so it's working.
It's
loading.
responding, but it's loading.
Okay. So will it appear full screen?
Yes.
Something with graphics. I know I had this problem in my class, and students are telling me that they cannot see
Are you guys frozen?
I am back. Apologize for disappearing. Just I start presentations and it went black. That's something I've never seen before. Let's try it again.
Your microphone
Is.
Is?
Can everybody hear me? Yes? No?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. Okay, so this is a long-term project of mine. I've been looking at female jockeys and discourses on the race course, and what struck me over time gradually is how many of these stereotypes about women and gender, they come straight away from the Middle Ages, not so much from the Middle Ages, I would say, but from what we think, what popular perception of the Middle Ages is. So I wanted to use this picture from this children's poem, The Centaur, as a stereotype of what a woman riding a horse should look like. And that's the stereotype which is still here with us, that all women, no matter how professional they are, they're kind of playing at girls being on horseback. And that's an image which media is supporting, but also, strangely, I found that women themselves are playing very much into this image, possibly because professional women athletes have to somehow retain their femininity. And this means in some way also retaining their pretending that they're girls playing with horses rather than being professionals. And men don't do that, but women do. So,
You're muted, Anastasia. We can't hear you.
Anastasia, you need
sorry.
to unmute. Yeah, better.
Sorry. Okay, so I'll start from the start, right? Okay. So, Arthurian women on the race course, and this has been a long-term project of mine. And I hope it will be published this year finally. I have been looking at the way female jockeys are representing themselves in media about horse racing, in films and books and interviews. What I found is that on the one hand there is this presumption that women are no good, and they're not good as professional jockeys. They are kind of girls playing with horses, as you see on this picture of from the children's book, The Centaur. And on the other hand, you see this discourse that women are as good as guys, as tough as guys. They're just the same jockeys. They're doing the same thing. They're not really different. That's what the female jockeys themselves are trying to tell in the interviews. On the other hand, there is this assumption that women are not tough enough, not competitive enough. They are going to have kids and then they will disappear from sport indefinitely. They don't want to take risks and so on. They're not hardworking enough either. Although in racing industry, there have been quite a lot of women working, mostly working as stable lads, stable lasses, grooms, and so on. But very few of them make it to the top like Haley Turner did. And I mean, there are just a handful of these people. Well, first of all, this is very male-dominated sport, especially jump racing. On the other hand, I think in media, there is this image that women are somehow this ideal Arthurian damsel, which need to be protected like this Queen Guinevere MAing. And I'm wondering to what extent women themselves sign in to contribute to this image. Possibly this has to do with the idea that women as athletes, by becoming athletes, engaging in this very strenuous physical activity, they shed some of their femininity. And of course, all female athletes are trying to go against this idea, trying to show that they don't lose their femininity, they're beautiful, they're still attractive, they're caring moms, and so on. But that takes away from their image as professionals. Men somehow don't have to do this. They don't have to show themselves as loving dads and as caring husbands.
Not connected to horses, but I can share a couple of anecdotes later on.
Yeah, you can, of course, but don't need to do this. Of course, sometimes they do, but it's kind of part of their market image. And of course, they don't have to prove that they're sexy, because by doing sports, they become even sexy and even more attractive. Whereas for women, it's vice versa. If you're tough, then you're not very womanly. And now I want to share this quote from Susan Gellier's book, One of the Lads. So Susan Gellier is one of those numerous women who are involved in racing industry, was involved. That book is quite old. So this is Racing on the Inside. It's a hilarious book, actually. I recommend reading it. It shows so many of these stereotypes about horse racing world and gender in horse racing. Not only gender among jockeys, but also stable lads. And Susan, she's in the early part of her book, she's discussing the use of terminology. There is this term stable lad, which is used for men because at her time it was still mostly men working at the racing stables. She was one of the few women, although these women were becoming increasingly more numerous, and she's rejecting the idea you should use the term stable less, because in her own words, the women are working as hard as men. They're doing the same work, and they're sometimes working a lot harder and longer hours, so they shouldn't be discriminated by these words. There is one passage which I read and which struck me. Here is this very British lady who is not like university level scholar or student of Arthurian romance, and she's describing one episode where she's exercising a racehorse, and as things happen, young racehorses, young thoroughbreds are very spirited animals. One of them runs away. So that's her words. Last summer, I used to ride a hysterical filly out every day, and one morning she bolted with me up Long Hill and continued down the other side at full tilt. heading for miles around, and all eyes were on us as we charged away. Henry Cecil, looking outrageously handsome on his great Arab steed, immediately abandoned his string and, like a true Sir Galahad, came thundering to my rescue. So, as a scholar of Arthurian romance, I was just struck by this reference to Sir Galahad, and of course the word "grey Arab steed" it just makes Henry Cecil look very much like a medieval knight on a great horse, except that we know medieval knights didn't ride Arab horses. And also, if you know anything about Arthurian romance, Sir Galahad isn't famous in medieval romance for saving damsels. He's not very interested in women. Of course, if you watch Monty Python, then that's a whole lot of different things. I'm just wondering, why Sir Galahad? Why not, for example, Gawain or Lancelot, who are kind of more associated with women? Why Sir Galahad, who in medieval discourse is this pure virgin, completely not interested in women? And this has something to do with Victorian stereotypes of women on horseback rather than and Arthurian women on horseback rather than with the medieval romances, where women actually travel as well as men, and as hard as men sometimes. And this takes me to yet another classic, The Black Beauty. If you probably remember, there is this episode, Lady Anne, chapter A Runaway Horse. And there, Lady Anne is described at the beginning of the chapter as a perfect horsewoman. And then one day she decides to ride a very spirited horse, so a female horse. Somehow this mares, in this case Lily, a bright bay mare, somehow these mares are always seen as hysterical, unruly, untractable, as opposed to Black Beauty, who is like very reasonable, very reliable, super reliable, the proper mount for a lady. And when she's being stopped by her cousin, who's kind of saying, well, maybe you should ride Black Beauty, she answers, my dear cousin, pray do not trouble your good, careful head about me. I have been a horsewoman ever since I was a baby, and I have followed the hounds a great many times, though I know you don't approve of ladies hunting, but still, that is a fact, and I intend to try this Lizzie that you gentlemen are all so fond of. So please help me to mount like the good friend you are. Again, with his gender assumption, with her cousin assuming that Lady Anne shouldn't be riding Lizzie, this kind of not so stable mare. Of course, gentleman rides is difficult horse, and gentlemen like it, and Lady Anne wants to show that she's as tough as they are. Probably she is quite courageous, but of course men are those clever guys. She should have listened, because of course Lizzie runs away, jumps a dike, and Lady Anne couldn't control her, and she falls and gets injured, and luckily she lives, and from that point on she and does Ladies of the Horse. It takes me back to Susan Gellier and this episode of Sir Galahad. In the Black Beauty, there are no Arthurian horses mentioned, but I think that's a closer parallel than Sir Galahad of medieval romance. And here is another image, and that's where I come to the point that somehow female jockeys are playing into this stereotype of not being professional, just being girls with horses, where on the one hand they are stating that yes, we had many injuries, as many as men, we are working as staff, we get as muddy as they are. And then you see those pictures when in 2011 Haley Turner was photographed for the Tetlem magazine, and this is one of the pictures where she is sitting inside saddle like a real lady. There were other pictures which you can see on Getty Images. They're not so Victorian, but much sexier. And she's certainly looking at a girl-playing jockey, not being a true professional. And here is another image which I just love. That's another famous jockey, Rosina Pravnik. And this image appeared in 2013 in the New York Times when she was um, eh, how do you say, she intended to take part in the Kentucky Derby. It appeared with a very provocative title. Can a woman win the Kentucky Derby? About Rosie, about her abilities, of her experience, although by that point she was quite established as a jockey. But no, it's about whether a woman can win the Derby. And of course a woman cannot. And a woman has never won a Derby, and of course Rosie is not going to win, and she didn't win. I'm just wondering about this picture. Why would they put this picture at the top of their article? And one of the comments to this online article, it just took the words out of my mouth, asking, would you have an upcoming male racing car driver pose for a short sitting in a toy pedal car? Don't think so. I don't think so either. I have never seen men, jockeys dressed as Victorian men, or sitting on carousel horses, or doing whatever stuff, or playing at Victorian boys with horse. In this picture, it reminds me, does it remind you of something? It reminds me of Velvet Brown. Is she a model female jockey? She's smiling, this dazed look forward. Is she this model female jockey? And the model of for all female jockeys, how they represent themselves in the media, because I mean this image, of course the journalists are using it in their own way, but it's not like Rosie was taken there and put on this carousel horse against her will. She did it herself. She knew this image would be used. Why? Is she willing to sacrifice her reputation as a professional to this media prestige to make it appear as a more feminine? I don't know. Oh, that's an open question. Why women want to make themselves look less professional and more like Velvet Brown? Well, she's charming as Velvet Brown, but we all know it's a fiction. We all know the Grand National has never been won by a woman, although it may be in future, but not so far. And this is wishful thinking. So do women subscribe to this stereotype or not? Okay, so that's it for me. And the floor is open for discussion. So we had 3 papers talking about very different things. Yes, we have 3 papers talking very different things, but I think about the same at the same time. So
I just wanted to add something to the docking of tails. There is an English article about the docking of tails of English clergy, which the nobility did, the secular nobility did, to basically dishonor the clergy and show them up as not being proper males.
Okay, could you share a reference to it? I think I know that, but it would be good if you could share this. Okay, so yeah, I mean with clergy as well, they're kind of in this shadowy status, liminal position. They're not quite. Well, of course, they are physically men. They don't stop being men by becoming clergymen, even if like some saints they jail themselves. They're still male, but they are somewhere in between women and men. Yes, yeah, I think that's the one. Tales of Masculinity.
Yeah, so the title never read the paper.
Yeah,
I'll have to correct this omission.
I think it's available in academia, or it used to be available in academia. Okay, any other questions, comments, ideas?
I don't know. Something else I was thinking about when you were doing this is that there's 2 things. One of the trope of naked women on horses. It seems like people are very interested in that subject. And I don't know if I've been asked multiple times by men about riding horses naked. It drives me bonkers every time it happens. But apparently that is something that people think about. The second one is a little more insidious, that I've actually had a reviewer, who I'm pretty sure I know who it is, a well-known male archaeologist, young male archaeologists that basically dismissed a lot of this, the idea that writing was early, that it's a horse girl thing to think that, saying that, you know, people that think that writing happened earlier are generally women that ride horses. And it was shocking to me that that turned up. It's a high profile journal, and that turned up in a review, and that I was disheartened to see that as part of the comments, that, you know, do we have to deal with this and review, you know, especially for people our age. So that was another issue. I don't know if anybody's come along that when you guys get, you know, if you have a bias when you talk about gender and horses when you have papers, if that is something that comes up.
Okay, there have been some comments. Let me take a look. So Pam wrote that draft horses that pull are still docked as well. And I have heard also that in Spain, these horses which are used for working with cattle could be docked, but for practical reasons, because the tail tends to get into the way, and yeah, they're still docked or their tail is tied up, but for different reasons. Yeah, Marianne is writing that she is interested in the Viking material. So in the sagas. And Rosie. Okay. Oh, Rosie is writing to Kate about evidence 6th to 4th century Greece and Macedonia showing individual male horses buried with or near male humans, presumably the owner rider. And yeah, so male horses for cavalry, female horses for racing and breeding. Any thoughts on this?
Is that from historical records or is this from archaeological sites?
Kate?
Oh, let's see.
Rosie was writing this. Yeah. So Rosie, could you please specify in the comments, or could you maybe unmute yourself if you can and just ask the question?
Yes, okay, I'm unmuted now.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, no, this is from archaeological records. The horses that have been found, you know, at sites.
I'd love to hear more about that. If you have references, I'd love to read the references.
Yes, of course. I'll try and I'll get hold of them and I'll write them in.
Excellent, excellent. One thing I didn't mention for archaeology is that a lot of the early burials that were examined with people and horses, or just people in general, they made assumptions on the grave goods if it was a male or a female without actually sexing the skeleton. So there's a huge, which is what happened to the Berka warrior. There's a huge amount of archaeological skeletons that have been missexed because people went on the grave goods and they assumed normative behavior with grave goods. So the grave goods set would match a male or a female, but actually when people start to sex the skeletons, it doesn't match up as nicely as they thought. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to go back and look and get actual accurate skeletal records. So that has been a huge change, because it was just an assumption that if people were buried with horses, they were men. If they were buried with weapons, they were men. If they were buried with jewelry, they were women. And as we have learned from the famous case of the Berka case, that is an incorrect assumption in a lot of ways. And it doesn't, and it seems to be the case for almost every period. So a lot of the earlier records, when they would do the inventories of the cemeteries, it wouldn't be done by sexing the skeletons. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Okay, thank you. Was a comment from Jennifer that there was a manual with bits from 15th, 16th century, and there were bits especially for horses with docked tails. I'm sure that has nothing to do with the tails, but with the status of horses.
You know, I don't know. It's a French manual, and I'm trying to remember which one it was. We've just been without power or water for 3 days because of the horrible winter storm here. So, or heat. So I'm a bit fuzzy about the exactly which reference it is, but I can find it for you. But the text was in French, and it was around the description. You know, it's one of these bit books. And the descriptions are in French, and one of them was specifically for horses with docked tails.
Wow.
So who knows? I'll find it for you and pass it along, though, Anastasia.
Yes, it's just fascinating how the anatomy works.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, Jörg has a raised hand. Jörg, do you want to speak? You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. On the female riders, I mean, if you look at medieval depictions, you have lots of medieval riders. I mean, if you just have to look at the Manesse Liederhandbuch, on the stories, women went falconing on horseback just as much as men did. They used different kinds of birds. They used smaller birds, but they rode out on horses to go hunting, you know, quite routinely. So, no, it would certainly be wrong to say that they didn't ride.
Yes, but you still get
ride,
even
ride well,
yeah.
not just ride, you know, being led or anything like that, but were active and competent riders.
Yes, and absolutely, and of course, noble girls had riding as part of their education and falconry as well. And I mean, in the article I'm publishing, I will be looking at women riding as well, and of course they rode the strides. And there is still this stereotype that medieval women only rode side saddle, which isn't really true, because they could ride side saddle for like courtly and ceremonial context, but certainly not hunting side saddle. And there are evidence from all over Europe, not just Western Europe, but also from Byzantine context. There was don't remember exactly the reference, but it was 13th century Byzantine chronicle about one empress who fell during a hunt from horseback, and after that she was infertile, couldn't have children, which means she rode there in a very dangerous context, and she fell and was dragged by a horse. That's why she couldn't have children. So high status women in Byzantium also rode very actively, and no reason why they wouldn't ride. And lots of raised hands, lots of comments. So who? Okay, let's start with Pam, and just the order of it on my computer. Pam, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sorry. So I have 2 comments. So going back to Kate's comment on being treated differently as a professional writing about horse things than being a woman. As an artist, I've had major issues with people not taking me seriously. They just kind of write me off as a horse girl who never grew up. And I've had major issues in college of like just being written off as like, oh, you're some kid who didn't grow out of the doodling horses in her notes. And I've had a lot of people try to tell me to draw something else instead of my horses. Luckily, I didn't listen to them, and I just kind of kept going. But it's still a major problem that a lot of horsewomen who are professionals in a certain industry just be kind of being written off. And then going back to men treating women differently who ride horses. If any of the ladies here can attest to this, men who don't ride horses, who are just not equestrians at all, tend to use women who ride as like a sexual fetish. Like they'll use it as like a flirtation, like, hey girl, like ride me like your horse, versus like taking us seriously that we're an athlete and we're doing this sport. They kind of use it to like flirt and use it as like a sexual reference. Like we have props and all that. And so that's kind of seen as like a red flag, you know, stay away from this guy. He's immature, he's weird. So there's also that going on.
Just as to continue on this, to a certain extent, I think women are subscribing to this stereotype, and we can certainly see it from, if you look at the a selection of interviews with famous female jockeys, you will see them in pink dresses, adding glamour to events and so on. So, to a certain extent, they're using this as of their public image, and they're getting certain benefits from it, I would say, from their publicity. It's just a question of whether women in this industry want to see themselves as professional, as equal to men, or as these sexy women who don't lose their sexuality. You cannot keep both. You cannot be both professional, it seems, and sexually attractive in this game. Just what you want to be. You have to make up your mind.
Well, actually, in a reverse way, it is also true for men. Because going back to this comment on the photo of Miss Napravnik, how I don't know, cannot imagine up and coming race car driver posing in the top